Who do you say that I am? This was the question that shook history and continues to challenge hearts and minds today. Was Jesus merely a wise teacher, a revolutionary, or something far greater? Join us as we critically examine the person and resurrection of Jesus, exploring faith, reason, history, and truth. This is God's Story, Our Story, Catholics for Israel's online Bible course, and today we ask, who was Jesus of Nazareth? Shalom and welcome back to God's Story, Our Story, Catholics for Israel's online Bible course, where we tackle the biggest questions of faith with reason, history, and critical thought. I'm Dr. Andre Villeneuve, and in today's episode, we continue our intellectual and spiritual journey to examine the identity of Jesus of Nazareth. In our last video, we considered Jesus' big question, who do you say that I am? We looked at Jesus' claims about himself in the Gospels, how he saw himself not just as the Messiah of Israel, but also as Son of Man, Son of God, and even Lord and God. But are these claims credible? Are they true? Was Jesus just another good man, a prophet, or truly the Son of God? Today we critically examine these claims and determine whether they stand up to scrutiny in light of the historical records. From the writings of Jewish and Roman historians like Flavius Josephus and Tacitus to the testimonies of the New Testament, we'll dig deep into the evidence. We'll explore how faith builds upon reason and why the claims of Jesus leave us with only a few logical possibilities: liar, lunatic, or Lord. We'll also dive into the reliability of the New Testament, its historical credibility, and the significance of the resurrection, the foundation upon which Christianity stands or falls. Get ready for a conversation that is both thought-provoking and challenging as we search for truth in the life and words of Jesus. This is no small matter. If Jesus was just a good and wise rabbi, then we can take him or leave him. But if he is the eternal Son of God who reveals God to humanity, then we'd better pay attention, because how we respond to him could be a matter of eternal life or death. As always, before we begin, please remember to like this video, subscribe to our channel, click the notification bell, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Who do you say that I am? Jesus of Nazareth, a critical examination of his person and life. Let's begin today with a quote from Pope St. John Paul II and his encyclical Fides et Ratio. He says this: "Faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. And God has placed in the human heart a desire to know the truth, in a word, to know himself, so that by knowing and loving God, men and women may also come to the fullness of truth about themselves." This was one of the great strengths of John Paul II's pontificate, that he really emphasized both faith and reason, how they go together. And this is how we approach the biblical texts from the beginning of our course to its end. And we will highlight this in particular in today's lesson, which focuses on this critical examination of the identity of Jesus. This is a slide that we've seen before, way at the beginning of our course, that confirms the words of John Paul II, that faith builds on reason, and you see that in this triangle on the screen. The bottom, the foundation of the triangle is reason, and upon reason we build faith, hope, and love. And so the whole edifice of our faith relies on a correct use of reason. Faith is not a blind impulse of the mind, but it is based on credible evidence. Faith is certain because it is founded on the Word of God who cannot lie. So this is quite the contrary of those who think that faith is just this blind impulse. It's something that some people have and other people don't, and it's not really connected to your mind or your brain. And so on the one hand, it's not a blind impulse of the mind. It's based on credible evidence, and indeed it's based on the Word of God that cannot lie. But at the same time, we can and should engage with the evidence that we see around us in the world, in history, in archaeology, and so on. Faith seeks understanding. So once again, faith does engage the reason, and very naturally, we want to know and understand the things we believe and the people whom we love. If you love someone, you want to know that person better every day, and it's the same thing with God. And so we believe in order to understand. We don't necessarily understand to believe. We have to begin with belief, but very often we need this foundation of reason to lead us to belief, to faith. And once we have this faith, we want to deepen our knowledge and understanding of God's revelation. Faith and science, both the light of reason and the light of faith come from God. Hence, there can be no contradiction between them. This also is quite in contrast to what many people think. They tend to put faith and science in two completely separate compartments that have little to do with one another, but that is contrary to the Catholic and Christian faith. That since God is the author of all truth, including the truth that is revealed in nature that can be observed and measured by science, and if he's also responsible for the truth of divine revelation, then there can be no contradiction between them. This is why faith builds upon reason to heal it, perfect it, and elevate it. Faith makes our reason stronger. It heals it from errors. It perfects it. It makes it able to see further than just our unaided reason. And it also elevates reason so that we are able to see things that we could never figure out just by the power of our natural unaided reason alone. And if you recall from the very beginning of our course, we talked about two errors related to faith and reason. One is very common nowadays, and that is rationalism, which attributes to natural reason a knowledge which only faith can confer. This is a type of secular arrogance to say that, oh, just with my brain I can figure out everything that I need to know, and I don't need any kind of help from the realm of faith. And so this is basically overconfidence in reason. And the opposite of that is underconfidence in reason, and that is what we call fideism, which is based on fide, which is the Latin word for faith. And fideism distrusts the reason's natural capacities. This is the type of faith that says, don't bother me with the facts. I'm just going to check my brain at the door when I come to church, and I don't really need to reason through what I believe. To be fair, very few Christians embrace a very hard form of fideism, but for sure we have some of it in the church. And so the faith of the church really navigates this middle ground between rationalism and fideism. We do trust in reason to some degree, but we don't have excessive confidence in reason alone. We know that reason has its limits and it needs the help of faith. This said, let us embark in our study of the person of Jesus. Of course, we continue our study of Jesus. We've already had 3 lessons that reviewed the content of the Gospels. In our last lesson, we looked at all of the various claims that he made. And today, once again, we are examining the validity and the credibility of these claims. The first question we ask is a basic one. Did Jesus even exist? And we know that in every age and every generation, we had people who did not even believe that Jesus existed. Now, the fact is that there is plenty of evidence for the historical life of Jesus. Even many very skeptical liberal scholars acknowledge that Jesus for sure must have existed. Someone who had such a strong impact on the course of human history was not just a fantasy that some people concocted in the first century. So what's the evidence? To begin with, obviously we have the 27 New Testament books. We have the 4 Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles. We have 21 epistles, most of them by St. Paul, others by St. Peter, St. James, St. John. And then we have the book of Revelation. And so remember that the New Testament is not one book, but it's 27 largely independent books that give us various eyewitness testimonies of the person of Jesus. So that's our foundation that points to the existence of Jesus. Then we have the writings of the Church Fathers. We have hundreds of writings from early Christians from approximately the years 90 to 600. And yes, they rely on the New Testament, but many of them knew the disciples, or they knew other Christians who had known the disciples, and so there was widespread understanding and historical memory of the person of Jesus among the church fathers. But you may say, well, they were Christians, they were biased. Well, first, the fact that they were Christians does not invalidate their testimony, but if you want some non-Christian sources, we have them as well. We have what we call secular sources, such as Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian of the first century. We have Cornelius Tacitus, a Roman historian, also from the first century. Others such as Pliny the Younger, the governor of Bithynia, and the Roman historian Suetonius. Now, of these, we're just going to look at two texts from the first two, Flavius Josephus and Cornelius Tacitus, just as examples of secular testimony to the existence of Jesus. Let's begin with Flavius Josephus. As we said, he was a very important Jewish historian from the first century AD. He was the commander of the Jewish forces in the Galilee when the Jewish revolt against the Romans began in 66 AD. He was captured and then started to work at the service of the Romans. Now, one of his great works is the Antiquities of the Jews, in which he traces back the whole history of the Jewish people. And this is a famous passage that is a little bit controversial because it seems to point so strongly to the messianic identity of Jesus that many say that, well, it seems like this text was manipulated or it was modified by Christian followers later, and not all of it is originally from Josephus. And so the full integrity of this passage is somewhat in doubt, but there's no doubt that Josephus did write about Jesus and that much of this passage is authentic. So what does Josephus say about Jesus? He says this: "At this time there appeared Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one should call him a man, for he was a doer of startling deeds, a teacher of people who receive the truth with pleasure. And he gained a following both among many Jews and among many of Greek origin. He was the Messiah. And when Pilate, because of an accusation made by the leading men among us, condemned him to the cross, those who had loved him previously did not cease to do so. For he appeared to them on the third day, living again just as the divine prophets had spoken of these and countless other wondrous things about him. And up until this very day, the tribe of Christians named after him has not died out." So as you can see, Josephus seems to be writing as a Christian. He says that Jesus was the Messiah, and in fact even confesses the resurrection, that he appeared on the third day after his death. And this is why some of these passages are in doubt in terms of their authenticity. But in any case, it's a very important passage attesting to the historicity of Jesus himself. Our next example is from the Roman historian Tacitus, who was governor of Britain in 80 to 84 AD. And he writes this: "Therefore, to squelch the rumor that Nero himself had set Rome on fire, Nero created scapegoats and subjected to the most refined tortures those whom the common people called Christians, hated for their abominable crimes. Their name comes from Christus, who during the reign of Tiberius had been executed by the procurator Pontius Pilate. Suppressed for the moment, the deadly superstition broke out again, not only in Judea, the land which originated this evil, but also in the city of Rome, where all sorts of horrendous and shameful practices from every part of the world converge and are fervently cultivated. Those who confessed to being Christians were at once arrested, but on their testimony a great crowd of people were convicted, not so much on the charge of arson, but of hatred of the entire human race." So Tacitus does not like Christians, and this really points to the authenticity of this passage. So what does he say? He acknowledges that there were these people called Christians who were blamed for the fire of Rome. He says this sect originated from a certain Christus who had been executed by Pontius Pilate. And so this matches perfectly what we know from the Gospels. And he says even the deadly superstition broke out again, which seems to point to the resurrection that had been suppressed for the moment by the killing of Christ, but it broke out again, this superstition, not just in Judea, but even as far as Rome. And so this is a very useful testimony on the part of Tacitus. So we know from Josephus and Tacitus and the witness of the New Testament and of the Church Fathers that Jesus for sure must have existed. And as we said last time, it is obvious from the New Testament and from the Gospels that Jesus was truly a man, but we also raise the question whether Jesus was only a good and wise man. So we raised this question last time, and let's examine it a little more closely today. Would someone who is just a good and wise man say something like this? I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Can you imagine your neighbor, your friend, a coworker who would tell you, I'm the resurrection and the life, and if you believe in me, you will never die? You would not say that this is a good person. You would say that this is a crazy person, someone who has a big ego problem and imagines that he is much more than he is. What about John 14:6? I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Another rather extraordinary claim. Now, last time we looked at many of those extraordinary claims that Jesus made about himself, but let's think about the consequences of these claims. And a famous reflection on these claims comes from the great English writer C.S. Lewis. In Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis writes this: I am trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on a level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. So Lewis says very clearly that when you look at the extraordinary claims of Jesus, he simply did not leave any room for us to say this was a good or wise man. Either he was very wrong, in which case we should have nothing to do with him, or if he was right, we should fall at his feet and worship him. In other words, there's no middle ground. Either he was right or he was wrong. If he was right and is God, we owe him everything. If he was wrong, we owe him nothing. And so this middle ground of just saying he was just some kind of a good man does not work at all. Now, if we break down this puzzle a little further, C.S. Lewis framed the identity of Jesus as either Lord, liar, or lunatic, and we can add a couple of options to that in a very systematic way. So let's look at this. Either Jesus never claimed to be God, or he claimed to be God. If he never claimed to be God, this would make Jesus a myth, okay? Now, if he did claim to be God, either he meant it non-literally and mystically in a type of New Age fashion, and this would make him a type of guru, or he meant it literally. Now, if he meant it literally that he was God, either it is false or it is true. If it is true, this would make Jesus Lord. If it is false, either he knew it was false and he would be a liar, or he did not know that it was false, which would make him a lunatic who is deluded and deceived. So let's look at these 5 options: the myth, guru, Lord, liar, or lunatic options. Did Jesus really claim divinity? Let's begin with the reliability of the New Testament, because this is at the foundation as to whether the stories about Jesus are true history or whether they are a myth. So we're going to look at this first option, that perhaps Jesus never claimed to be God, and we're looking at a myth. Perhaps Jesus never claimed to be God. Perhaps this is a myth that his disciples fabricated long after he died. If Jesus never claimed divinity, then all of Christianity's claims are a myth. But we know, as we saw last time, that the New Testament does assert that Jesus is God. So the big question here is, can we rely on the New Testament's account of the life of Jesus? So let's do a few tests here on the reliability of the New Testament. The first one is the bibliographical test, and it consists in this. Since we don't have the original documents, how reliable are the copies we have in regard to the number of manuscripts and the time interval between the original and the extant copies of the New Testament that we have? Now, the fact is that we have more than 20,000 copies of New Testament manuscripts in existence today. We have some 5,686 Greek manuscripts, which are generally the oldest ones, including 307 uncial manuscripts, which are written in all capital Greek letters, including, for example, the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus, which include almost the entire New Testament, and these date to the 4th century, around 350 AD or so. We have 2,860 minuscule manuscripts in cursive writing, and then we have 2,410 manuscripts of lectionaries. These are the books that were used in the early church to read the readings during the liturgy, during the Christian liturgy. In addition, we have more than 10,000 Latin Vulgate manuscripts and more than 8,000 Ethiopic, Slavic, Armenian, Syriac, and other manuscripts. So altogether, over 20,000 copies of New Testament manuscripts that are in existence today. This is an enormous number. In addition to this, we have some 36,000 quotations of the New Testament in the writings of the Church Fathers, which is enough to reconstitute almost the entire New Testament. So even if we did not have the New Testament, we could reconstitute it just with quotations from the Church Fathers. Now, how do these numbers compare with other ancient texts? Here is a comparison table of ancient writings. Here on the bottom, you can see the New Testament. So from the 1st century AD, and the earliest copies are from the 2nd century AD, meaning less than 100 years later than when the texts were actually written. And we have some 5,600 Greek manuscripts, which means that the accuracy of the copies is in the order of 99.5% accuracy. In other words, we know with extreme certainty that the New Testament is the actual text that was written in the 1st century. Now compare this with other authors. For example, the second most attested text is Homer's Iliad, which was written in 900 BC, but the earliest copy we have is from 400 BC, which would be 500 years later, a lot more of a gap between the original and the extant manuscripts. How many copies do we have? 643. So this text of the Iliad is also very well attested by 95% accuracy, but still we can see it's much less attested than the New Testament. If we go to, for example, Caesar's Gallic Wars over here, Caesar lived from 100 to 44 BC, and the earliest copy is from 900 AD. So we're looking at a 1,000-year gap between the time when the Gallic Wars were written and the oldest manuscript we have today. The number of copies, only 10. Compare this with the 5,600 copies of the New Testament. So what's the accuracy of the Gallic Wars today? Well, it's really not all that great, but nobody questions the accuracy of the works of Julius Caesar or Tacitus or Aristotle or Sophocles. Everybody takes for granted that these texts are roughly the texts that the authors themselves wrote centuries before the earliest manuscripts that we have. So all this to say that the authenticity of the New Testament manuscripts is extremely accurate. We can know with great certainty that these are the texts that the disciples wrote. Here are some examples of ancient New Testament manuscripts. For example, the oldest one, the John Rylands Papyri, which contains portions of John 18, dates to 125 to 130 AD, and so many people would have been alive at that time who had personally known John the Apostle. The Bodmer Papyrus, which contains most of John's Gospel, from 150 to 200 AD, so far less than 1 century after it was written. Others, such as the Chester Beatty Papyri, contains major portions of the New Testament and dates to 200 AD, so really not that long at all after these texts were written. And then the major codices, such as Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, Alexandrinus, all these codices, which basically mean a book, contain either almost the entire Bible or all of the New Testament and half of the Old Testament, or in the case of Alexandrinus, almost the entire Bible as well. And so once again, we have an excellent attestation of the New Testament texts. Now, if we move to the internal evidence test, what do we mean by that? We mean whether the written record is credible and to what extent. So we move from the actual manuscripts that we have to the inner coherency between the writings themselves. Now, as we read ancient texts, we should follow a basic principle that we should extend the benefit of the doubt to the document's author. And so it's okay to be a bit skeptical, a bit critical, but we don't dismiss the entire authenticity of a text just on the basis of our feelings. We begin by granting a certain credibility to the text. In other words, it's innocent until proven guilty. It's authentic until proven to be a forgery. And that is an attitude of humility that we should extend to ancient texts. Primary source value. The New Testament authors wrote as eyewitnesses or from first-hand information. We know that from the texts themselves. Two of the evangelists, Matthew and John, were from Jesus' inner circle of disciples themselves. The two others, Luke and Mark, were disciples of disciples. It is generally accepted that Luke was a disciple of St. Paul and Mark was a disciple of St. Peter. And so we have very close eyewitness testimony from either those who lived with Jesus or those who knew the ones who spent their time with Jesus. The New Testament accounts of Christ were being circulated within the lifetimes of those alive at the time of his life. These witnesses could confirm or deny the accuracy of these accounts. It would have been very easy to refute or dismiss or disprove these accounts had they been false, and we have no record of that in the first century. So here are the major books of the New Testament and the commonly accepted dates when they were written. St. Paul's letters, written from 51 to 62 AD, Mark from 64 to 70 perhaps, Matthew and Luke from 80 to 85, and even that's a bit of a liberal estimate. Other scholars have proposed that all of the synoptic gospels, and some have even said the Gospel of John, were all written before 70 AD, the destruction of the temple. Book of Acts, also possibly 85 AD, and the Gospel of John, certainly before 100 AD. So all of them written in the first century within decades of the events that they narrate. There are no first century documents that contest the New Testament texts. Next, we move on to the external evidence test. What is that? This is whether other historical material confirms or denies the internal testimony of the documents. We've already talked about the Church Fathers. Here, the writings of the Apostolic Fathers confirm the authenticity of the New Testament text. Authors such as Clement of Rome, who wrote still in the first century, Ignatius of Antioch, early second century, Eusebius quoting Papias, who lived in the early second century, Polycarp and Irenaeus, also from the second century. So all these early witnesses only confirm the New Testament and do not dispute it. Then we have the evidence of archaeology, which confirms the New Testament record. No archaeological discovery has ever contradicted a New Testament biblical reference. If you go to Israel today, you can go to Jerusalem and visit the Pool of Siloam at the southern end of the city of David, where Jesus healed the blind man, or you can go to the Pool of Bethesda, north of the Temple Mount, where Jesus healed the paralytic. You can go on the Mount of Olives. You can visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is the place of Jesus' crucifixion. You can see the Church of the Nativity, where Jesus was born in Bethlehem. You can go to Capernaum in the Galilee, to Magdala. You can see all these sites that are talked about in the Gospel, and all of them match what we know from the biblical record. So what do we get from all this? That the New Testament documents are extremely reliable. In summary, what are the problems with the myth theory? Well, the texts are remarkably reliable. The state of the manuscript is very good. We have never heard of any opposition to the myth of a divine Jesus in the first century. And if the idea that Jesus was divine was a myth, then we should have some kind of evidence of an earlier layer of a non-divine Jesus. But we don't have such evidence of beliefs in Jesus who was just a normal human being in the first century. The style of the Gospels is not that of myths, but of eyewitness description. Jesus' claim to be God does explain his trial and crucifixion. Why would they have put to death just a simple itinerant preacher who just preached love and forgiveness and kindness? Jesus said something very shocking to the Jewish people, and that was his claim to be God, as we saw last time. 7, we don't have just one gospel account, but we have 4 independent witnesses that confirm each other. 8, who would invent this myth of a divine Jesus? What would they have to gain? All the apostles were put to death for this belief. 9, first-century Jews and Christians were not prone to believe in myths. They were actually quite skeptical and very prone to believe what had been passed down to them in Jewish tradition and in the scriptures. They would not just have believed in some kind of myth that emerged out of nowhere. Finally, no mere man could have invented this story of a God who was crucified and rose again from the dead in order to bestow his life upon all people. In conclusion, the myth theory is dispelled. The New Testament documents are too reliable and credible for us to dismiss the gospel accounts as myths. Second possibility, perhaps Jesus was a guru. Perhaps he claimed that he was God, but he just meant it non-literally, mystically. We shouldn't really take him too literally when we hear his claims that he is the Son of God and God. So let's examine this second possibility. Perhaps Jesus claimed that he was God, but in the Eastern sense that we are all gods, we all share somehow in the divinity. Well, this is fairly easy to answer. Jesus was a Jew. He was not an Eastern mystic or guru. The Jewish concept of God is completely different from the Eastern concept of God. And here on this table, you can see the contrast. Judaism is a public religion that focuses on keeping the law. Eastern religions focus on inner experience. Judaism believed in a transcendent God, whereas the Eastern religions believe in a pantheistic and immanent God. In Judaism, God is a person, but in Eastern religions, God is impersonal. In Judaism, time and history are real. In Eastern religions, time and history are unreal. In Judaism, God can be known, but in Eastern religions, God is unknowable. In Judaism, God is an active initiator, but in Eastern religions, God is passive. In Judaism, God is moral. In Eastern religions, God is amoral. He has no will. In Judaism, after death, there is an eternal heaven and hell, but in Eastern religions, there is no hell. So we see radically different worldviews between Jewish monotheism and Eastern pantheism. So if Jesus said that he was God, if he made claims to divinity, definitely this had to align with the Jewish God. There is no way that he would have referred to himself as some kind of Eastern divinity or guru. And so this second possibility is easy to dismiss. Jesus could not have meant it non-literally if he made any claims that he was divine. Jesus could not have claimed to be a God in the Eastern sense. He claimed to be God in the Jewish understanding of the word as the transcendent creator of the world. Let's move on to the next possibility. Maybe Jesus was a liar. Maybe he claimed to be God. Maybe he meant it literally, but in fact this claim was and is false. And if it was false, maybe he knew that it was false. In other words, Jesus lied about his identity. Jesus was a liar. If when Jesus made his claims, he knew that he was not God, then he was lying and deceiving his followers. He was also a hypocrite, teaching others to be honest while living a lie. He was also a fool because this lie led to his crucifixion. So this raises a lot of questions. What in the world would be Jesus' motivation to lie about being God if this would lead to an excruciating death on the cross? And to be fair, this portrait of Jesus just does not match his life, his selfless character, and his high ethical teachings. This from the man who said, "Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Always speak the truth." He spoke about integrity, honesty, being perfect as our Heavenly Father is perfect. So it does not make any sense at all that Jesus would be a liar. He simply had the wrong psychological profile. He was unselfish, he was loving, caring, compassionate, passionate about teaching truth and about helping others. Liars usually lie for selfish reasons like money, fame, pleasure, or power. But Jesus gave up all worldly goods and life itself for his mission. There's no conceivable motive for his lie. It brought him hatred, rejection, misunderstanding, persecution, torture, and death. And there was also no hope at all that his lie would be successful. The Romans would put him to death. That would be the end of the story. They would scatter the disciples, and that would be it. So it really makes no sense at all to posit that Jesus lied in order to make this claim that he was divine. So we can dismiss the liar hypothesis. But perhaps Jesus was a lunatic. Perhaps he claimed to be God. Perhaps he meant it literally. It was false, but he didn't know it was false. Jesus was a lunatic. Let's examine this option. Perhaps Jesus thought he was God, but he was mistaken. He was sincere, but wrong. The problem is this also does not fit with the man who uttered some of the most profound sayings ever recorded. Anyone who has a divinity complex is usually recognized as a psychopath. The character traits of a psychopath are well known. We're talking about egotism, narcissism, inflexibility, dullness, predictability, and so on. Certainly not anything like the character of Jesus, who had the essential virtues of taking care of others, of demonstrating wisdom, love, and creativity. So the psychopath profile of a lunatic simply does not fit with the man who uttered some of the most profound sayings ever recorded. So if Jesus was not a liar, if he was not a lunatic, if he was not a guru or a myth, this leaves only one option, that Jesus claimed to be God, he meant it literally, and it is true. This would mean that Jesus is Lord and God. So who do you say Jesus is in the face of this evidence? Okay, the second thing we're going to look at today is the resurrection, legend or history. We know that the resurrection is the cornerstone of the Christian faith. Here are a couple of passages from St. Paul in his first epistle to the Corinthians. If Christ is not risen, then our preaching is empty and your faith is also empty. And again, St. Paul, for I delivered to you first of all that which I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures. The Christian faith stands or falls with the resurrection, and our salvation is indeed dependent upon the resurrection, as St. Paul writes. And so, if you still have doubts about Jesus' identity, we need to look at this crucial question of the resurrection. First, what do we mean by the resurrection? Well, the resurrection is not several things. The resurrection is not a ghost. The resurrected Jesus had a real body. The resurrection is not just a resuscitation like Lazarus. Jesus' resurrection is permanent. The resurrection is not reincarnation into another body. It is not enlightenment or nirvana where the individual is absorbed into the one. The risen Jesus is a distinct individual. The resurrection is not assumption into heaven. Jesus did come back to earth. The resurrection is not a vision that is spiritual and subjective. The risen Christ was seen in public. He was touched. He ate. The resurrection is not a myth or a legend that is only symbolically true, perhaps in the imagination of the disciples. The resurrection really happened. So that's what we mean by resurrection. Jesus was dead and he was alive again, came back in his original human body. So did the resurrection happen? Let's examine the possibilities just as we did with the identity of Jesus. Now, obviously, Jesus either died or he didn't die. If he didn't die, what could have happened? Perhaps he was severely wounded, he swooned, he passed out, he was buried, and somehow he recovered and came back to life. This is known as the swoon theory. Now, if he did die, obviously either he did not rise or he rose from the dead. If he didn't rise, then perhaps the apostles were deceivers. They made up a story to tell the world. So this would be the conspiracy theory. Perhaps the apostles were deceived. They just had a bad day, they were very confused, and they imagined that Jesus had come back from the dead. And this would be the hallucination theory. Perhaps the apostles were myth makers. We're connecting back to the myth that we just dispelled a few minutes ago. But perhaps Jesus did not rise. They did not intend to deceive anyone. They were also not deceived, but they just said, let's just make a nice story out of the life of Jesus that's going to inspire people. And this would be the myth theory. Finally, the fifth option, Jesus indeed rose from the dead and Christianity is true. Now let's look at the facts. After Jesus died, he was wrapped in a linen cloth. About 100 pounds of aromatic spices were applied to the wrappings about the body. The body was placed in a solid rock tomb. An extremely large stone of about 2 tons was rolled against the entrance of the tomb. A Roman guard was stationed to guard the tomb. Fear of punishment produced flawless attention to duty, especially in the night watches, so it would have been nearly impossible to get by the Roman guard. The guard affixed on the tomb the Roman seal, a stamp of Roman power and authority. But the facts are that on the third day, the tomb of Jesus was empty. Women arrived at the tomb on Sunday morning and found it empty. Angels told the women that Jesus is risen, and Jesus is said to have appeared to many people, including more than 500 of his followers at one time, according to the testimony of St. Paul. So let's look at these 5 different options. First, the swoon theory. Perhaps Jesus did not die, he was severely wounded and then recovered. Perhaps Jesus didn't die on the cross, but only fainted from exhaustion and loss of blood. Everyone thought him dead, but later he was resuscitated and the disciples thought it to be a resurrection. Well, this has been proposed already a couple of centuries ago, and we know that there are several big problems with the swoon theory. For one thing, Jesus could not have survived the crucifixion. The Romans made sure that the people they executed were really dead, and we know that they broke the legs of those who were crucified, as we read about in the Gospels, and this would have caused them to asphyxiate because they could not hold themselves up anymore. The fact that the Roman soldier did not break Jesus' legs means that he was already dead. Blood and water came out of Jesus' pierced heart, a sign that his lungs had collapsed. The body was encased in winding sheets and entombed. So how could a half-dead, weak, and staggering sick man in urgent need of medical treatment could have convinced the disciples that he conquered death and the grave and had resurrected for the sake of granting his life to all peoples? This would have been really hard to convince his followers of this scenario. Who could have overpowered the Roman guard? The cowardly disciples? The women? Unthinkable. Who moved the 2-ton stone? This would have been a major feat in itself, in the presence of the Roman guard. And if Jesus awoke from a swoon, then where did he go? As we said, he would have been severely wounded, weak, barely in a situation to continue teaching to his disciples and pretend to ascend into heaven to begin this new religion. He would have died at some point later, and so what happened to him if he just rose up from his swoon? So this swoon theory is all but abandoned today. It just does not make any sense. What about the conspiracy theory? Perhaps the apostles conspired to deceive the world into believing the most successful lie in history, that Christ was resurrected. There are also some serious problems with the conspiracy theory. No early Christians ever believed or admitted that the resurrection was a conspiracy, even under torture. You would think if it were a conspiracy, someone would have talked about it. Someone would have said, hey, all this stuff, it's fake. It didn't really happen. We would have some kind of testimony, but we have absolutely nothing. A group of fishermen came up with the most creative, enduring, life-changing story ever told and founded the greatest religion in the world based on a conspiracy? That would be very strange. The disciples' simple and honest character argues strongly against such a conspiracy on the part of all of them, with no dissenters. They were transformed from fear to faith, despair to confidence, confusion to certitude, cowardice to boldness, and all willingly died for their conspiracy. Makes no sense. There is no possible motive for such a lie. They were hated, persecuted, imprisoned, tortured, exiled, crucified, boiled, roasted, beheaded, and fed to the lions. What would they have to gain by coming up with such a conspiracy that would lead to their torture and death? If the resurrection was a lie, then the Jews and Romans would have just produced the corpse, right? If they would have made this up, then the Jews and Romans could have just opened the grave, taken out Jesus' corpse. There is the body, end of the story. The disciples could not have gotten away with proclaiming the resurrection in Jerusalem with all its eyewitnesses if it had been a lie. People would have checked the tomb, people would have seen Jesus, there would have been contradictory accounts, and it just would have been refuted within days. It just could never have gained any traction if this had not been true. So the conspiracy theory is highly unlikely. A conspiracy would have been unearthed by the disciples' adversaries very easily. So alongside the swoon theory, the conspiracy seems extremely unlikely. But maybe we're looking at a hallucination. Jesus did not rise, the apostles were deceived, and therefore they suffered a hallucination. Let's look at this option. Perhaps the apostles were deceived by a hallucination and just imagined that they saw the risen Christ. There are also problems with the hallucination theory. There are just too many witnesses. Hallucinations are private, individual, and subjective. Christ appeared to Mary Magdalene, to other women, to the disciples, to Paul, and to 500 people at once. Hallucinations usually last a few seconds or minutes, but this one lasted for 40 days repeatedly. Hallucinations do not eat, but the resurrected Christ did eat. The disciples touched him. They spoke with him, and he spoke back. If the apostles hallucinated, the corpse would have been still in the tomb. Again, why did the Jews and Romans not stop the rumors and just produce the body? A hallucination could not explain the empty tomb, the rolled away stone, or the inability to produce the corpse. So very similar to the conspiracy theory, the hallucination just does not make any sense. Well, what about the myth theory? Perhaps the apostles were myth makers who came up with this beautiful myth to inspire future generations. Perhaps the apostles created a myth, not meaning that the resurrection be taken literally. There are also problems with the myth theory. The style of the gospel is radically different from the style of all ancient myths. There was just not enough time for a myth to develop, not even one generation after the actual events. The apostles and disciples immediately set out to preach the risen Christ in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth within days and weeks of the resurrection and ascension of Christ. The first witnesses of the resurrection were women who had low social status and no legal right to serve as witnesses. So if you were writing a myth, you would not say that women were the first witnesses to the resurrection. You would have people of much greater authority witness Jesus' rising from the dead. The New Testament itself repudiates the mythic interpretation. Peter says, "We do not believe in cleverly invented myths, but something that truly happened." The Gospels were written by the disciples and not later myth makers. These were not literary folk. They were fishermen and tax collectors. The Gospels we have today are essentially the same as the originals. So there was just no time for the development of complex myths as we see in the ancient Near East. So with this, we can eliminate the fourth option that the apostles were myth makers. This leaves us only one possibility, that Jesus indeed rose from the dead and that Christianity is true. The birth and rise of Christianity can only be explained by the resurrection of Christ. In conclusion, I'm not going to get into this here, but I'd like to invite you to look up the Shroud of Turin. This is the famous linen shroud that is now in Turin, upon which is the imprint of a man who was clearly crucified. You can see bloodstains in his hands and feet. You can see that he wore a crown of thorns. And miraculously, as if an extremely powerful light shone from his body, the imprint of his face and his body has been left on this shroud. And here you can see the head on the top picture And so I really invite you to look it up online and see how well attested it is that this seems to be a first century man who's crucified in Judea, and somehow his body, his facial features were imprinted on this Shroud of Turin. All this explains the preaching of the early church as we read in the Acts of the Apostles. This Jesus God has raised up, of which we are all witnesses. Therefore, let the entire house of Israel know with certainty that God has made him both Lord and Messiah, this Jesus whom you crucified. And so Jesus is risen indeed. If you'd like to read some of the sources I use for this presentation, I recommend the works you find here on the screen. We've explored the life, claims, and impact of Jesus, his teachings, his miracles, and the bold assertion that he was more than just a man. So what do you think? Could he truly be the Son of God? The conversation doesn't end here. Next time, we turn to the mystery of the Trinity, the Christian belief in one God in three persons. How can God be Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? Is it logical, biblical, and historically supported? Can it be reconciled with the Jewish faith in the one God of Israel? We'll break it down and uncover the life-giving truth and profound beauty behind Christianity's most central doctrine. Until then, keep searching, keep questioning, and keep seeking the truth. I'm Dr. Andre Villeneuve, and this is God's Story, Our Story, where reason meets faith. Shalom, and I will see you next time.